All right, hello and welcome. So the format for today's video is going to be a little bit different. I sat down with Peyton over at Fourth Radical YouTube channel, and we talked about possible VP candidates and what might be involved with all of that. So check it out, and here you go. So we're here today. We're talking with Peyton from Fourth Radical, and we're
Hey
going to
guys.
be discussing the VP possible VP situation with Joe Biden going forward. So, Peyton, do you have any thoughts on this to start things off?
Well, look, I mean, the whole VP thing, obviously, it's not a situation that sort of as progressives that we wanted to be in. Nobody likes the idea of Joe Biden. I made a video not too long ago. I think it's time for, look, we need to be looking at the possibilities of Joe Biden dropping out. But if he is going to be moving forward with this thing and he isn't going to be dropping out, we also do have to think strategically when it comes to the issue of VP. And um, I mean, I guess I would ask you to sort of kick off. Like, did you have a particular VP pick that you were number one with?
I don't. I've kind of bounced this issue around inside my own head sometimes, and I try to kind of wrap my brain around like how important the VP spot is. And I kind of on different days I come to different opinions of how important is the VP position, because if you think back to the 8 years that Biden was VP, it's hard to come up with something really important that was done in those 8 years, right? So you kind of wonder, well, what is the magnitude of this?
Right.
And yet
But is
the
that
oh, I was
right?
going to say the perception kind of makes it, the perception of it being important makes it important, right? Because people start talking about it and you put someone
Sure.
on the ticket. So there is a very real sense in which it is important. And I think we kind of have to look at the fact that Biden being VP is kind of how he became the candidate, right? I mean, if he didn't have those 8 years as VP, he probably wouldn't be where he is. So there's definitely some lasting effects, and I definitely struggle with what are the real properties a VP needs to have in order to meet that level of importance. Like, is it really as a figurehead to kind of lead the people, or is it the actual work that they do in office? And I don't know. Depending on where you come down on what you really want out of a VP, then it determines who's better suited than other people. And I still definitely don't have a firm idea on what I think that position should be for Biden, at
Well,
least.
well, I mean, when it comes to Joe Biden, the particular issue is, of course, the guy looks like he has dementia. Whether or not he actually does, look, I'm not a doctor, I have no idea, but he certainly struggles to get some of his sentences out. And so, it seems like you could make the argument that in the same way that Dick Cheney really ran the show under George W. Bush, perhaps the VP is really going to be running the show in this instance. Now, one big sort of caveat here, which is that in the case of Dick Cheney had been in the executive branch, the executive office for like 20 some, I don't actually know. I wasn't even alive at that point, right? He had been in the executive office for so long. So he really knew the ins and outs. He could really maneuver the stuff, really get things going. So is, the particular VP pick going to have all that particular kind of leverage? Well, it's not particularly clear, especially when you talk about a VP pick who, like in the case of Kamala Harris, it's not clear what her ideology was. You followed her campaign, and one of the criticism, even of centrist kind of establishment Democrats, they said that, look, when it came to Kamala Harris, she was flip-flopping, flip-flopping, flip-flopping her campaign, and so she wasn't able to make a message that really landed, that could really resonate, because her message was constantly changing, because she was more interested in looking at the polls, trying to figure out the poll testing, than talking about what she actually believes, if she believes anything. I'm sure she really does have some things that she believes in, but she was always more interested in looking at the polls than talking about from her soul, like, what is the things that Kamala Harris really, like, et cetera, et cetera. So when it comes to being able to leverage executive power, you could make the argument that those sort of waffling liberals who are more interested in the polls and in public opinion than in their own ideology, that, look, those people, they're not going to have any kind of VP leverage. So it doesn't even matter if it's Amy Klobuchar or Kamala Harris. It's going to be exactly the same. But you could make the case that someone like, look, I know that this is going to get me in hot water, a lot of progressives, but you could make the case that Elizabeth Warren at least does have some kind of ideology, and that, she actually would have specific things that she's interested in. Whether or not you think that, those are the things that you would want is another question, but she actually does seem to have at least some kind of ideology. And so she actually might be interested in leveraging her position in a way to get things done.
Yeah, and that's interesting because Elizabeth Warren is one of the few where I think there actually could be a strategic argument for picking her because, right now the progressive wing feels very left out. And I know Elizabeth Warren's kind of a lot of people have a lot of feelings about that, but people are calling on the Biden group to make some kind of reaching out to the progressives that feel like they got left behind.
Yeah. Could I make a comment on that?
Yeah.
So my my real feeling on this is that, these centrist Democrats come out thinking, oh, well, if we pick someone like Elizabeth Warren, that's a real reach out. That's what the left really wants. We're reaching out to the left. How about you ask us what we actually want? Because if you actually poll and talk to lefties, talk to Bernie Sanders supporters, it's not clear that Elizabeth Warren is what we want. And so there seems to be a disconnect between who they say are progressives and who we say are progressives. And so when we talk about having a kind of democratic, all-inclusive, democracy, I think it should include actually asking us lefties what we want, as opposed to saying, okay, well, Elizabeth Warren is a progressive, therefore, choosing Elizabeth Warren as VP is a sort of all, what's the word? What's the term? Like a branch, an olive branch or whatever. Oh. Yeah. But I lost the word for it. But like, is it really? Is it really?
Yeah. And I agree. It's definitely more nuanced than just saying, oh, she's, some people say she's a progressive, so she's going to get all those people that are, the alienated Bernie fans are going to show up now in position. So and
when it comes to Elizabeth Warren, like she actually damaged her own credibility when it comes to the left, because her whole thing was how she's against the big banks. She's against centrists. She ran and initiated her political career by criticizing Joe Biden that, hey, look, when you talk about women's rights, you can't just be talking about issues of domestic affairs. It's also about the economic issues which specifically impact women. The fact that women are more likely to go into debt when it comes to, going to college because more women go to college, that these things are women's issues too. And so she entered the public career by criticizing the neoliberal consensus. But then when it came time to actually, go against that consensus, you could make the case. I mean, you could argue for or against this position, but you could make the case that she was thinking to herself, well, I can maximize my influence, my leverage in Congress by actually sort of going along, get along, kind of, let's play the game, ring around the rosy type stuff. But that's precisely the thing. That kind of pragmatic mind is precisely the thing which lost her leverage with the left. So now, I mean, what's her real overture to the left? It's no longer clear. Anyway.
Yeah, and I still, my mind just kind of goes back to this whole thing where she dropped out and then she endorsed Biden, and it's just always kind of been, it's like I feel like I got half of a conversation where I'm missing, like what did I miss here? What's happening that I don't quite get what's going on.
And not only did she endorse Biden, she waited and waited and waited until even after Bernie. So she was entirely right. She knew that if she endorsed Biden while Bernie was still in the race, it would be bad for her. But she knew that she wasn't going to be endorsing Bernie anyway. Now, look, I've never been the one to say that Elizabeth Warren was, exactly the same as many progressives or many socialists. She said that she's a capitalist to her bones. Obviously, capitalism, whatever you think of that, okay. Personally, I'm more of a socialist. But, I always heard that, and I always understood that she was maybe a little bit, the same. But I guess I never quite criticized her when it came to what she actually said she believed. But then it seems like her actions spoke a little bit differently.
Yeah, and it always just leaves me wondering, like, because of that endorsement, and especially because it came so late, was there some kind of deal in place where she was trying to get the VP, or because otherwise I just can't make sense of the whole situation.
Well, and even last time around, the rumors were that was why she didn't endorse Bernie Sanders, was because Hillary Clinton was supposedly like courting her for VP. But of course, she wasn't Hillary Clinton was never actually going to do the offer because the banks didn't like it. And by the way, reports out now that Elizabeth Warren, that, Joe Biden was talking to some of his like donors and stuff and about Elizabeth Warren for VP, and they didn't like the idea. So even Elizabeth Warren, as much as, us progressives may not be, super warm to her right now, banks still don't like her.
Yeah.
So
it's just hard to know. And then you start looking at other candidates and you kind of start to just wonder, like, what is the strategy in this day and age for picking a VP? It seems like this whole idea where you pick someone that it may help you win that state is maybe not doesn't play out the way that it used to.
Yeah.
So what is the strategy when they're looking at a VP? Like, what are they hoping to pick up? Is it more about you picking up a certain voting block because you pick someone
Yeah.
of a race
Well,
or ethnicity or?
I think that to some extent, and this is just my opinion here, just from my readings and looking at the data, I feel like it tells the continued story of sort of the continued nationalization of politics, which is that in the past, people, even all the way up to the 60s or the 70s, people would primarily identify with their state as opposed to identifying with their country, with brief exceptions during like World War I or World War II. All the way up to that point, we say, oh, I'm a Virginian first, I'm a Californian first, and then I'm an American. But more recently, of course, people identify first as an American, and then maybe even to their city, and then to their state. And so when we talk about people being able to win states because, I mean, what is her name? What's Michigan governor?
Oh,
Gretchen Whitmer, is that Gretchen?
yeah, so I forget off the top
Something
of
like
my
that.
head.
I'm
Yeah.
so sorry. I'm going to look terrible in this, but one of the entire reason why she's even under consideration for the VP pick is because she's from Michigan, and we need Michigan, and she happens to be looking really, really good right now with some of this coronavirus stuff. So, I mean, that obviously helps there. But the question is whether or not that sort of connection, like, oh, that's my governor, therefore, I support this person, even if I'm maybe a moderate or swing voter, because, oh, I know that they're going to care for the values of Michigans. But I mean, Michiganders. But, when it comes to, capitalism, especially people constantly moving around. I mean, you don't have local communities in the way that you did in the past because, you go to college, you were raised in one state, then you moved maybe one or two times growing up, and then you went to college in another state, then you got, a job here, then you got a job there. And so you don't actually have those kinds of local kind of attachments to your real area anymore. And so the argument that like, oh, well, if I just pick the governor who's from that state, not particularly clear, not particularly clear. And that's just a trend that we've been seeing continue throughout the course of American history. And it's funny because, you read the Federalist Papers, and that was one of the fundamental assumptions in how our government actually works, right? That interest groups are going to compete, and that people will be more interested in their states, in their local interest groups, as opposed to the national interest groups. And that's entirely how our Constitution is written. But anyway.
Yeah. And even within the states now, it seems like there's, quite a few states. You'll have one city, like say Seattle, that is very much thinking one way politically. And then as soon as you leave that city, the rest of the state is entirely different. So it's just seems like many states themselves have gotten so polarized. If you have one major city and then a bunch of less populated areas, that even people within a state are just vastly different from each other.
Well, right. And I mean, and that's deeply connected to the story I was just mentioning, which is that urban people, especially in, wealthier cities, like, you're talking about DC, New York, who have these kind of urban elites, those are precisely the people who are constantly moving around and don't have any kind of identity to identify with like internationalist, transnational movements, which is fine. And in many respects, I identify that way myself. But it's very different, very detached from the kinds of people who, living in more rural areas who, don't necessarily feel that way. They maybe did live in the same place for much of their lives and have a very different narrative, very different story. And, of course, with the increased polarization, rural areas almost universally voting Republican, urban areas voting very much so Democratic, seems to be a big problem.
Yeah. Do you have either a feeling of what you think would happen with Biden as far as his pick, or like what you think would be a smart move for him to make for his pick?
Look, no one's going to like what I have to say, but I think that the only he's not going to pick like Bernie Sanders, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, there was a number of progressives who are out there saying, look, the only way that we're going to be voting for Biden is if he picks Bernie Sanders as VP, because then Bernie Sanders will at least be able to maybe get one or two of his policies through while he's in VP. He's obviously not going to pick Bernie, and he's probably not going to pick Nina Turner either. You could make the case that Elizabeth Warren is the better pick compared, like, if you're debating who's better, Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris, like, I mean, come on, like Elizabeth Warren, obviously, even if you don't trust Elizabeth Warren to do the things that you want her to do you trust Kamala Harris? Not particularly clear there either. Or Amy Klobuchar, I don't think, like, in my opinion, now, here's what I do think. I don't think that they're going to pick Elizabeth Warren. Now, I could be wrong. But I think that Katie Porter is a more likely pick, or Gretchen Whitmer. I think that's her name. just because, I mean, this whole campaign that they've run is just entirely neoliberal stuff. Or they could just go around, play it safe, and pick Kamala Harris. Who do you think's more likely between the two, by the way, Kamala Harris or Amy Klobuchar?
I don't know. To me, neither one of them is an exciting pick. I don't know.
Brother.
I guess it depends if they're really trying to fit categories, like we want to pick a woman or we want to pick a black woman. I mean, if that's kind of the focus, is that they're trying to hit these certain check boxes, then I don't know. It seems like Klobuchar was definitely, gained enough popularity that she could maybe be a good choice. I don't know. I don't see what either one of those people really bring to the table, though, as far as like from a strategic standpoint. I just don't see it. And
right. Well, the thing with Kamala Harris is that, well, she's a she's an African American woman, and so the argument is that she can help sort of solidify that base. But the thing, though, that other people are pointing out, which is that Joe Biden said that he was going to be picking an African American, I believe African American woman for the Supreme Court. So some people have argued that gives him sort of leeway to pick a white woman for VP. We'll have to see how that plays out. Now, look, when we're talking about that kind of stuff, my brain shuts off because I'm like, this is the wrong way to be going about politics, in the first instance, and it actually just makes me upset from the get-go. But that's how they think, right? That's how these people think.
Yeah.
So.
I could see more of an argument that the Supreme Court needs a black woman than that the VP does, because it seems like now that representation on the Supreme Court is lacking.
Yeah, no, 100% on board with that. Like, I absolutely agree with that. It's definitely an important thing to do, for sure. Absolutely.
And so, do you think if he was to go after a VP choice that was more progressive, I mean, do you think there's just sort of outside of the progressive movement, there's kind of this like toxic attitude? I mean, like if he picked AOC, then obviously, which no one's suggesting he will, but Fox News would fire up, and it would just be this kind of attack. Is there a possibility that you could pick someone to the left that isn't toxic?
I would be happy if Joe Biden picked AOC. It would make me, reconsider, whether or not I was going to be voting for him. It would make me, look at it a little bit more closely. I think she might be too young, though, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yeah. But regardless, hypothetical world. That's possible worlds. That's what philosophers do all the time. Talk about a possible world. In that world, I could consider that, and yes, I do think that would lead to the kind of polarization. However, there's a lot of sort of socialism or socialist views which don't necessarily trigger right wingers in that kind of visceral way, but they've sort of set it up around AOC by conflating socialism with kind of the urban divide that I was sort of speaking about, that where rural people that don't necessarily feel their connection with the sort of connection is sort of lacking.
Is there any other thoughts you wanted to add to the conversation?
Not particularly. I mean, I guess let's both of us, let's just say a name and then put our name on who we think it's going to be. I'm going with Kamala Harris. I think that she's the most likely pick. Do I want her as the VP? No. Let me repeat that. No, I don't want Kamala Harris, but I think that Kamala Harris is the most likely, if I had to, guess.
Yeah, I don't know. And I don't know if it's not me thinking about it. I mean, I like the idea or of kind of hearing these ideas about Stacey Abrams or Elizabeth Warren, but I kind of, I guess, feel like it's probably going to be Klobuchar.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, Klobuchar did have that Freudian slip where she said that she was on the ticket or something like that. Although, actually, we shouldn't end it now then, because you just mentioned Stacey Abrams, and I just wanted to say one thing about Stacey Abrams, which is that she came out, interestingly, and said that, like, oh, well, as a black woman, it's my, I've learned that you have to raise your hand if you want to get listened to. And so she was explicitly making her pitch for why she wanted to be VP, whereas the Michigan governor, again, gosh, I wish I could look up her name, Gretchen Whitmer, I think
that's right. You're pretty much right, I think.
Yeah, she basically came out and said that, look, well, it's, you shouldn't, that's not a role that you apply for, you get picked for it. And so I'm only going to, do my thing, which of course was her way of, begging to, be picked. I just thought that was like one of the funny quirks of the news. She's like, "Oh yeah, as VP, you shouldn't like go out asking for it. You shouldn't apply for it. You're just gonna get picked because they look at you by how like meritocracy and like, wow, you're so good." But that's her way of raising her hand, of course.
Right.
So I don't know.
It's hard because they want to put their name out there sometimes, but then you want to make sure your state knows that you're there for them. You're not trying to like move on, to some other position and leave them behind.
Yeah, that's true. Actually, in my area in Virginia, there was some guy who was running. His name was Dan Helmer. Actually, he is currently in the Virginia State or House of Delegates. But he had initially run for Congress in actually my congressional district as a Democrat, and then and he was kicking out a Republican, and I went to one of his debates, and that was the main criticism that the Republican was making, although he was definitely going to lose, just the way things were swinging. But he was like a long time incumbent. He's like, look, I'm here for this state, I'm here for this area. And I'm not seeking higher office. Whereas in the case of Dan Helmer, it was obvious, like he was just using this as a stepping stool. He still hopes to get to Congress one day. That's like his. He's one of those like Rhodes Scholars, so he's starting out in the House of Delegates, but he 100% sees everything as a stepping stone. But it didn't seem to really bother voters. It didn't seem to really bother voters that he was, looking for higher office, largely because, where I live in Northern Virginia, going back to what we were talking about earlier, where I live in Northern Virginia, it's a very sort of DC based area, and everybody moves around. There's no like real like, oh, this is Fairfax County, this is our community. It's more so just, oh, well, we're an economy that sort of serves DC. And it's actually sad to see. I mean, my dad was in the military, so I've moved all around. I, lived in different areas. So it's hard for me to even relate to a specific area, but I do see things decaying because of that. I think that it is a problem. Anyway, this maybe turned into more of a conversation than a
That's all right. No, that's great. That's great. So that was a great conversation about VP. So make sure to head over and check out Peyton on Fourth Radical. I'll leave some links to his social media stuff online, so you can go over and check out more of his stuff. Thanks a lot, Peyton, for the conversation, and we'll meet up soon.
Appreciate it, you guys.